Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Douglas Mackenzie stopped hiking because the trees were growing upside down. Not metaphorically, not as some trick of perspective. The pines ahead of him had their root systems reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers, their canopies buried in earth that couldn't possibly support them. He stood on the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail at 11:47 a.m. on October 3, 2004, with his Garmin GPS showing the correct coordinates and his geology degree insisting this was impossible, while 30 feet ahead of him, physical reality had apparently decided that gravity was optional. Douglas had spent the last 15 years explaining away the supernatural. As a geology professor at Montana State before taking this ranger position, he'd published 3 peer-reviewed papers debunking mysterious cave formations that local tribes claimed were spiritual sites. His blog, Rational Wilderness, had 40,000 subscribers who appreciated his no-nonsense approach to wilderness mythology. Just last month, he'd given a lecture in Kalispell titled, "Why Your Ancestors Were Wrong: Science versus Superstition in the Northern Rockies." The Blackfeet elder in the audience who'd walked out halfway through had muttered something in her language that the translator refused to repeat. Now Douglas stood staring at lodgepole pines that defied every law of botany, physics, and basic goddamn sense, and his carefully constructed worldview began developing stress fractures. He pulled out his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot A80, 3 megabyte storage, cutting edge for 2004, and photographed the inverted trees from multiple angles. Evidence, documentation. There would be a rational explanation. Possibly some kind of underground gas pocket that had explosively inverted the soil strata, though that didn't explain how the trees remained alive with their roots exposed to open air, or how their needles were somehow growing downward into buried canopy. The temperature dropped 15 degrees between one breath and the next. Douglas's exhalation became visible vapor. His fingers went numb around the camera. This was wrong. The Weather Service had predicted highs in the low 50s, typical early October in Glacier National Park. He checked his watch. 11:51 a.m. 4 minutes had passed since he'd stopped walking, and the ambient temperature had plummeted from comfortable to hypothermic. Frost formed on the upside-down tree roots. Impossible. Frost required sustained cold, required atmospheric conditions that took hours to develop, not seconds. Douglas watched ice crystals spread across bark in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like words. The frost was forming words in a language he didn't recognize. Syllables that hurt to look at, that made his optic nerves ache with the same quality as staring at the sun too long. Physiological response to unexpected stimulus, Douglas said aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Possible migraine aura, temporal lobe seizure activity, dehydration affecting visual processing. He'd been hiking for 6 hours searching for Parker Jensen, the 23-year-old seasonal ranger who'd missed 2 consecutive radio checks. Probably low blood sugar. Definitely not supernatural manifestation. The frost words pulsed once, bright enough to hurt, then the trees simply weren't there anymore. Not gradually, not fading. Between one blink and the next, the inverted pines ceased to exist and the trail continued normally ahead. Slight upward grade toward Ptarmigan Tunnel. Everything exactly as the topographic map indicated it should be. Douglas stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, his academic mind cataloging symptoms. Possible hallucination, possible gas exposure, possible early onset schizophrenia, though he had no family history. The camera showed 17 photos of normal forest. No inverted trees, no frost words. Just standard lodgepole pine growing in standard upward orientation. His hands had stopped shaking. The temperature had returned to the predicted 53 degrees. Everything was fine. Everything made sense. Except for the sound. Distant but getting closer, something large moving through the forest parallel to the trail. Not a bear. Douglas had encountered dozens of grizzlies in his 3 years at Glacier. Knew their gait, their breathing patterns, the specific way they disturbed undergrowth. This moved differently. Heavier, but somehow lighter. Footfalls that seemed to land in impossible intervals, like the thing crossing space in ways that didn't require consistent contact with ground. And underneath the footsteps, a sound like teeth chattering, like someone frozen beyond shivering, jaw clenching and unclenching in rapid spasm, bone clicking against bone with metronomic precision. Douglas had read the Blackfeet stories about Glacier's backcountry, had dismissed them as folklore, cultural explanations for natural phenomena that pre-scientific societies couldn't properly understand. The Wendigo legends particularly annoyed him. The idea that some cannibal spirit haunted the northern forests, that humans who ate human flesh transformed into skeletal monsters driven by insatiable hunger. Obvious cautionary tale about starvation cannibalism. Nothing more. The cold association clearly stemmed from hypothermia's well-documented effects on cognition. The chattering sound stopped. Douglas's radio crackled. "Mackenzie, this is dispatch, requesting status update." He fumbled for the Motorola XPR on his belt. Grateful for the connection to rational bureaucracy, to paperwork and protocols and things that made sense. "Dispatch, this is Mackenzie. Approximately 9 miles in on Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail. Still no sign of Jensen. Visibility good, weather holding. Continuing search." "Copy that. Be advised, temperatures dropping faster than predicted. Weather Service now calling for significant snowfall by 1800 hours. Consider turning back if you haven't located Jensen by 1500. Douglas checked his watch. 11:58 a.m. 3 hours to find Parker Jensen or abort the search and hike 9 miles back to the trailhead before a potentially dangerous early-season storm trapped him in the backcountry. His pack carried emergency supplies, but spending a night at elevation in October, snowfall wasn't optimal even with proper gear. "Understood. Will advise. Mackenzie out." The radio went dead. Not lost signal. The display showed full battery, correct channel. But when Douglas keyed the transmit button, nothing happened. He tried his backup frequencies. Silence. The Motorola had worked perfectly 30 seconds ago, and now simply refused to function. Equipment failure. Happened constantly in the field. Probably moisture in the connection ports. Douglas pulled out his backup communication device, a Garmin Rhino 120 that combined GPS with two-way radio capability. Top of the line for 2004, cost him $400 out of pocket because the Park Service budget hadn't covered it. The Rhino's screen showed his coordinates: 489247 degree N, 113.68 Naumwedig W, correct position for the Ptarmigan Tunnel Trail at mile 9. But the elevation readout flickered between 7,100 feet and impossible numbers. Negative elevations, readings in the hundreds of thousands, then briefly showing an altitude of exactly 0 before resetting to correct elevation. Douglas had a PhD in geology from Stanford, had taught undergraduate courses in geomorphology, had published research on mountain formation in the Rockies, understood erosion and tectonics and the fundamental processes that created the landscape around him. Equipment malfunctions he could explain. Temperature anomalies could be rationalized. Brief hallucinations might indicate medical issues requiring attention, but didn't challenge the basic structure of reality. But standing on a trail in Glacier National Park in 2004, while his GPS insisted he was simultaneously at 7,000 feet and at the bottom of the ocean and in outer space, that suggested something had gone fundamentally wrong with either the equipment or his perception, or the basic laws governing physical existence. The chattering sound resumed, much closer now. Douglas turned slowly, scanning the forest. Dense lodgepole pine, typical undergrowth of huckleberry and beargrass. Terrain consistent with USGS surveys and his own extensive field experience. Nothing out of place, nothing moving. Then he saw the prints. 10 feet from the trail, pressed deep into soft earth. Footprints that started as human and became something else mid-step. The first print showed a normal boot tread, size 11 or 12. The second print was bare, elongated, toes stretched to impossible length. The impression so deep it suggested something far heavier than human weight. The third print was larger still, the toes transforming into what looked like claws, each digit leaving a furrow 8 inches long. The fourth print was missing because whatever left the first 3 had apparently decided walking was optional and had simply stepped into the air and continued upward into the canopy. Douglas photographed the prints with hands that had started shaking again. The camera's digital display showed the images clearly, progression from human to inhuman, from natural to impossible, documented evidence that would survive his potentially deteriorating mental state. Except when he reviewed the photos, they showed normal forest floor. No prints. The memory card insisted it was empty, despite showing 17 previous images. Acute psychotic episode, Douglas said aloud, his voice steadier than he felt. Possible toxic exposure. Possible. He trailed off, because even as he spoke, his eyes tracked movement in the canopy. Something massive pulling itself between trees that shouldn't support its weight, branches bending and not breaking under what physics insisted should snap them like toothpicks. He ran. Not a conscious decision. His body simply took over, academic reasoning overridden by something older and less concerned with logical consistency. Douglas ran back down the trail, boots pounding earth that felt increasingly uncertain beneath him, the forest blurring into gray-green smears as his peripheral vision began stuttering like corrupted video. Behind him, ahead of him, above him, the chattering intensified until it became a chorus, dozens of jaws clenching in harmony, creating a rhythm his heartbeat tried to match. Douglas's lungs burned. The air tasted wrong, carried flavors of old ice and older hunger, something that had been cold so long it had forgotten what warmth meant. He burst into a clearing and stopped so abruptly he nearly fell. Parker Jensen stood in the center of the clearing, 23 years old, seasonal ranger, backcountry hiking enthusiast, amateur wildlife photographer. Douglas had met him twice during orientation, remembered a cheerful kid from Bozeman, excited about the position, talking enthusiastically about getting shots of mountain goats in the high country. The thing in the clearing wore Parker Jensen's uniform, but stood wrong, joints bending in sequences that suggested his skeleton had been disassembled and imperfectly reassembled with extra pieces. His head cocked at an angle that would have snapped a normal neck, his mouth hung open wider than human jaw structure allowed, and from that gaping mouth came the chattering, Parker's teeth clicking together so rapidly they blurred. Douglas Mackenzie. Parker's voice emerged underneath the chattering, both sounds occupying the same acoustic space impossibly. The scientist, the denier, the man who writes such confident words about things he cannot begin to comprehend. Douglas's training insisted he should be documenting this, recording observations, collecting data. Instead, he stood frozen while every rational framework he'd built his career on collapsed like a controlled demolition. Parker? His voice cracked. What happened to you? The thing wearing Parker smiled, and the expression was so wrong that Douglas's visual cortex briefly shut down, his brain refusing to process what it saw. Parker ate. Parker was so hungry after 3 days lost in the high country. Found the hiker who'd fallen in the crevasse, been there for weeks, preserved by the cold. Parker told himself it was survival, told himself rescue was coming, told himself it was just meat, just protein, just staying alive. The temperature plummeted again. Douglas's breath became frozen clouds. Ice formed on Parker's uniform, spreading across fabric in geometric patterns that looked almost like the symbols Douglas had seen in that research paper about Algonquian pictographs, the one he'd dismissed as cultural anthropology nonsense. But meat that was human changes things, Parker continued, his voice dropping to a whisper while the chattering intensified. Opens doors, breaks seals, invites things into the space where your soul used to live. Now Parker is so hungry, Douglas, so incredibly, impossibly hungry. And it doesn't matter how much he eats because the hunger is the thing itself, is the spirit that lives in men who break the oldest law. Douglas's geology training finally provided something useful. Run from the fucking monster. He turned and sprinted into the forest, abandoning the trail, crashing through undergrowth while behind him Parker laughed, a sound like ice calving from glaciers, massive and wrong and getting closer. The forest changed as Douglas ran. Trees grew at impossible angles. their bark flowing like water, their branches reaching and grasping. The ground became uncertain, solid earth transitioning to something that felt more like suggestion than substance. His boots splashed through puddles that shouldn't exist this high up, water that was somehow frozen and liquid simultaneously. He burst through a stand of pines and nearly fell into a ravine that didn't exist on any map. 100-foot drop to a creek that ran uphill, water defying gravity as casually as the trees had defied it earlier. On the opposite side of the ravine, a figure stood watching. Not Parker. Older woman, Blackfeet features, wearing traditional dress that looked simultaneously ancient and freshly made. She raised one hand, palm out, and spoke in a language Douglas didn't understand but somehow knew was Ojibwe, the same language family as the Frost words, the same linguistic root as the Wendigo legends he'd spent years dismissing. "You cannot run from truth," she said, and Douglas understood despite the foreign words. "You cannot think your way free from what hunts you. The rational mind is a candle against a forest fire when the Wendigo walks." "This isn't real," Douglas gasped. "Hallucination, gas exposure, migraine, psychotic break. Denial is a luxury the dead cannot afford." The woman gestured behind him. "It comes, the one who ate and became eaten, the hunger that walks on two legs and wears familiar faces. You must choose, scientist. Do you die insisting the impossible cannot exist? Or do you live by accepting that your understanding was always incomplete?" Douglas turned. Parker stood 20 feet away, but Parker was changing, growing, his skeleton expanding with sounds like branches snapping, his skin stretching and tearing, revealing something underneath that looked like winter given form. Elongated limbs, emaciated torso, antlers erupting from a skull that was no longer remotely human. The Wendigo. The actual, literal, impossible Wendigo from Algonquian legend. The thing that lived in the spaces between starvation and survival. The thing that transformed men into monsters when they crossed the line from human to cannibal. Douglas's academic mind supplied facts even as his primal brain screamed. Wendigo mythology documented across Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, and related cultures. Described as skeletal giants with hearts of ice, associated with insatiable hunger, with consuming victims and growing larger with each meal. Said to possess humans who engaged in cannibalism, transforming them into creatures of pure appetite. All folklore, all cultural metaphor, all impossible. The Wendigo opened its mouth, Parker's mouth but elongated, filled with teeth that looked like icicles, and screamed. The sound was hunger-given voice, was the cry of everything that had ever starved, was cold and want, and endless consumption compressed into acoustic form. Douglas fell to his knees, hands pressed to ears that couldn't block out the sound because it wasn't really sound. Was something that bypassed auditory processing and went straight to the hindbrain, straight to the parts that remembered being prey. The woman across the ravine spoke again, her voice somehow cutting through the Wendigo's scream. The spirit world bleeds through in the thin places. The boundary weakens when blood is shed, when taboos are broken, when the modern world forgets the old warnings. You stand in such a place, scientist. The park you think you know is built on land that remembers older laws. Will you learn? Or will you feed? The Wendigo lunged. Douglas rolled sideways, purely instinctive, and felt claws. Actual physical claws that couldn't exist but absolutely did. Rake across his pack, shredding nylon like tissue paper. His gear spilled across the ground. Sleeping bag, camp stove, first aid kit. Useless electronic devices that insisted reality was consistent and measurable. He scrambled to his feet and ran again. No destination, just movement, just the desperate animal drive to escape predation. The forest had become a nightmare landscape, trees growing in spirals, the ground rising and falling in waves like the earth was breathing. Above, the sky flickered between normal October overcast and something else, a darkness that looked less like nighttime and more like the absence of existence, like reality had simply stopped bothering to render that section of universe. Douglas burst through a stand of aspens and stopped. He was back at the clearing, same spot. But the Blackfeet woman now stood where Parker had been, And Parker, the thing that had been Parker, circled the clearing's perimeter with predatory patience. "Time is negotiable here," the woman said. "Space folds. The Wendigo exists partially outside your linear perception. You cannot outrun it because you're still thinking in terms of distance and duration. The spirit world has different rules." "Then what do I do?" Douglas was shaking, his entire body vibrating with adrenaline and terror and the cognitive dissonance of experiencing something that shouldn't exist. How do I survive? Survive? The woman's expression suggested the question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding. "This isn't about survival, Mackenzie. This is about whether you continue to die slowly, denying truth until it consumes you, or whether you accept what you've spent your life refusing to see." The Wendigo screamed again, and this time Douglas felt the sound physically, felt it trying to pull something out of him. His warmth, his life, the basic heat that separated living tissue from frozen meat. His fingers went numb. Ice formed on his eyelashes. The temperature was impossible, had to be -40 or colder, cold that should kill in minutes. "The Wendigo is hunger," the woman continued, "but also truth. It shows you what you really are beneath the comfortable lies. Parker Jensen broke a taboo and invited it in, but you invited it too, Mackenzie. Every time you dismissed the sacred as superstition, every time you reduced mystery to geology, every time you stood on native land and declared the ancestors were ignorant, you opened doors you didn't believe existed. I can't, this isn't." Douglas's vocabulary, his carefully constructed academic language, was failing. Words were inadequate. Rationality was inadequate. Everything he'd built his identity on was inadequate. The Wendigo moved closer. Douglas could see Parker still in there, could see the young man's face visible beneath the skeletal mask, his eyes wide and aware, and trapped inside the hunger that wore him like clothes. "Help me." Parker's voice emerged, thin and desperate beneath the chattering. "It's so cold, Douglas. I'm so hungry. It doesn't stop. The hunger doesn't stop. I ate my own fingers trying to make it stop, and they grew back, and I ate them again, and it just gets worse. Please, please kill me. Please end this." Douglas's hand moved to his bear spray, useless against a spirit, against something that existed partially outside physical reality. The Wendigo laughed, the sound like ice cracking, and lunged again. But this time Douglas didn't run. Some part of him, the part that still believed in cause and effect, in measurable phenomena, in the scientific method, that part finally broke, shattered completely. And in the space where rational certainty had lived, something else emerged. Vision. Not hallucination. Vision. He saw the forest as it really was, as it had always been beneath the reassuring overlay of topographic maps and trail markers and National Park Service signage. Saw the thin places where the spirit world pressed against the physical. Saw the boundaries that weren't walls but membranes, permeable and shifting. Saw the Wendigo not as a creature but as a principle, a cosmic constant, the universe's response to the breaking of fundamental laws. And he saw himself. Saw Douglas Mackenzie as he truly was, not a scientist bringing light to superstitious darkness, but a man so terrified of the inexplicable that he'd built walls of equations and academic credentials to hide from anything that didn't fit his narrow comprehension. The vision expanded. He saw Parker Jensen's last days, lost in the high country, rationing food that ran out too quickly, finding the body in the crevasse, telling himself it was survival, taking that first bite, and feeling something ancient and hungry recognize the invitation, feeling the door open and the cold thing slide in. He saw the Blackfeet woman, not as she appeared now, but as she'd been 50 years ago, 70, 100. The same person watching the same thin places, keeping the same vigils, speaking the same warnings that men like Douglas Mackenzie never listened to. He saw the land itself, Glacier National Park as it existed before that name, before any European names, when the Blackfeet knew it as places where spirits walk, respected it, understood that some spaces belonged to things older than humanity, and he saw his own death. Not now, not here, but eventually, inevitable. the ego death required to accept that he'd been wrong about everything fundamental. Could see two paths: keep denying and let the Wendigo take him, transform him into another hunger spirit stalking these mountains, or accept the truth and become something different entirely. The vision ended with the woman's voice. Choose, Mackenzie. Die as you lived, insisting the impossible isn't real. Or humble yourself and live with the knowledge that you understand almost nothing about the world you walk through. Douglas looked at the Wendigo, at the thing wearing Parker Jensen like a coat. Looked at the woman who might be human, or might be something else using a human shape to communicate with someone still trapped in linear thinking. Looked at his hands, at the Garmin GPS that showed impossible elevations, at the camera full of photos that documented nothing, because reality didn't translate to digital format when you were standing in places where reality was optional. I was wrong, he said quietly. The words cost him everything: his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed identity as a man who knew things, who understood things, who could explain things. I was wrong about all of it. The Wendigo is real. The spirit world is real. The warnings were true and I dismissed them because I was afraid of not understanding. The temperature rose 30 degrees in a single heartbeat. The Wendigo stopped moving. Parker's face became more visible beneath the skeletal mask, his expression confused like someone waking from a nightmare. Acceptance opens different doors, the woman said. Humility creates space for new understanding. You cannot unknow what you've seen, Mackenzie, but you can choose what you do with that knowledge. Douglas stood on shaking legs. Parker, can he be saved? He ate human flesh, broke the deepest taboo. The Wendigo won't release him completely, but with help, with proper ceremony, with understanding that some wounds require spiritual medicine rather than physical, perhaps he can be bound, contained, prevented from spreading. How? The woman smiled. By admitting you need help, by asking for it, by setting aside the arrogance that insisted you knew better than thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. Douglas pulled out his radio. Still dead. The GPS still showed impossible readings. His camera still contained no evidence. But the woman was right. He needed help beyond anything his Park Service training provided. I need help, he said aloud. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't understand what's happening. I need someone who knows how to deal with this. The woman nodded. First truth you've spoken in years. Come. We bind the hunger spirit before it spreads. You watch. You learn. You begin to understand that the world is larger and stranger than your textbooks admitted. She turned and walked into the forest. Douglas followed, leaving his ruined pack behind, leaving his equipment and his certainty and his comfortable denials. Behind them, the Wendigo, the thing that had been Parker Jensen, made a sound that might have been relief or might have been grief. It followed too, bound now by something Douglas didn't understand but could feel, could sense the way animals sense approaching storms. They walked for hours, though Douglas's watch insisted only minutes had passed. The forest changed with each step, becoming more itself, more wild, more true. He saw things moving between the trees that might have been animals, or might have been spirits, or might have been both simultaneously, saw patterns in the bark that resolved into faces when viewed from the right angle, heard whispers in Ojibwe, in Cree, in languages that predated language. They reached a clearing Douglas recognized from his maps, Helen Lake, elevation 7,100 feet. But the lake he saw didn't match the topographic surveys. This lake was older, deeper, its surface reflecting not the sky above but something else, somewhere else. The woman began to speak in Ojibwe, her voice creating harmonics that suggested multiple people speaking in unison. She moved through the clearing in patterns that looked like dance but felt like mathematics, like she was solving an equation in three-dimensional space. The Wendigo followed her movements, the thing that wore Parker responding to rhythms older than written history. Slowly, impossibly, the skeletal form began to compress to diminish Parker's human shape becoming more visible as the hunger spirit was forced back, bound by words and movement and understanding that existed completely outside Douglas's academic framework. It took 3 hours. Might have taken 3 minutes. Time was negotiable in this place, in the thin spaces where the spirit world bled through. When it ended, Parker Jensen lay on the ground, human again but changed, his eyes holding knowledge that Douglas suspected would never leave him. The woman knelt beside him, placed her hand on his forehead, and spoke words that sounded like forgiveness and warning and instruction all at once. "He will need ceremony," she said to Douglas. "Proper spiritual cleansing. The hunger is bound but not gone. He cannot be left alone, cannot be sent back to normal life. Will your park service understand?" Douglas thought about the reports he'd need to file, the explanations he'd need to provide, the career implications of admitting he'd witnessed shamanic binding of a Wendigo spirit. Thought about his blog, his published papers, his reputation as a rational skeptic. "No," he admitted. "They won't understand. I didn't understand. But you do now. That's a beginning." The woman stood. "The Blackfeet have protocols for this, for people who've crossed the boundary and can't fully return. We will care for him. But you have different work now, Mackenzie." "What work?" "You've seen the truth, seen the spirit world, witnessed what your science says can't exist. You can go back, tell no one, let people think Parker simply got lost and went mad. Keep your comfortable life, or you can do the harder thing. Which is? Speak truthfully. Write honestly. Admit you were wrong. Help others understand that the world is stranger and more sacred than modern thinking admits. Accept that you'll be ridiculed, dismissed, called crazy by people who sound exactly like you did a week ago." Douglas looked at Parker, at the broken young man who'd eaten forbidden flesh and paid a price that science couldn't measure. Looked at the lake that reflected impossible spaces. Looked at his hands, still shaking, still trying to process everything his brain insisted couldn't have happened. "I'll speak truthfully," he said quietly. "I don't know if anyone will listen, but I'll try." The woman smiled. "That's all the spirits ask. Honest witness. Humble recognition that human understanding is always incomplete. Now come. We need to get Parker to proper healers, and you need to get back to the trailhead before you're reported missing." They walked back through the forest, and with each step the world became more normal, more familiar, reality solidifying around them like water freezing into ice. By the time they reached the trail, Douglas's watch showed reasonable time progression. His GPS showed correct elevation. His radio crackled to life with dispatch asking for a status update. "This is Mackenzie," he said into the radio. "I found Jensen. He's alive but needs immediate medical and spiritual support. Requesting emergency evac at Ptarmigan Tunnel trailhead." "Copy that. What's his condition?" Douglas looked at Parker, who stared at nothing, who shivered despite the reasonable temperature, who'd been touched by hunger that couldn't be satisfied and cold that couldn't be warmed. "Complicated," Douglas said. "You'll need to contact the Blackfeet tribal authorities. This is beyond standard SR protocols." The pause suggested confusion. "Say again, Mackenzie? Tribal authorities?" "Trust me on this, call them. Ask for someone who understands spiritual emergencies. They'll know what that means." Another pause. "Copy. We'll relay. ETA for standard evac is 2 hours." "Understood." Mackenzie out. The woman was already fading, becoming less solid, less present. "We'll be watching," she said. "Helping where we can. Parker will be cared for. You, remember what you saw. Write it truthfully. Accept the consequences." Then she was gone, simply wasn't there anymore. And Douglas stood on a normal trail in a normal forest with a traumatized young ranger who'd eaten human flesh and been possessed by a Wendigo spirit, and absolutely no way to explain any of this that wouldn't sound like complete psychotic break. The evac team arrived 90 minutes later. They stabilized Parker, asked questions Douglas couldn't answer, made worried notes about potential psychiatric issues. The Blackfeet authorities showed up 30 minutes after that. A healer and 2 men who took one look at Parker and nodded like they'd seen this before, like they knew exactly what had happened. They took Parker away in their vehicle, not the hospital ambulance, and the lead paramedic looked confused but didn't argue. Douglas suspected strings had been pulled, calls had been made, old agreements between the Park Service and the tribal authorities had been invoked. He hiked out alone as sunset painted the mountains gold and purple. His camera held no evidence. His GPS showed normal data. His radio functioned perfectly. Everything suggested nothing impossible had occurred, except Douglas knew, had seen, had witnessed the thin place where the spirit world pressed through, where the Wendigo walked, where all his comfortable certainties had shattered like ice under spring sun. 3 days later, sitting in his ranger station office, he opened his laptop and navigated to Rational Wilderness, his blog dedicated to debunking supernatural claims in the wilderness. He deleted every post. In their place, he wrote a single new entry. I was wrong. For 15 years, I've dismissed indigenous knowledge, sacred traditions, and spiritual understanding as superstition. I've insisted that science could explain everything, that the supernatural was simply the not yet explained natural. I was arrogant, dismissive, and fundamentally incorrect. I cannot prove what I experienced in Glacier National Park. My equipment captured no evidence, no photographs, no recordings, nothing that would satisfy the scientific method I've worshipped my entire career. But I know what I saw. I witnessed the Wendigo. I spoke with spirits. I stood in places where the boundary between worlds is thin, where the rules governing reality become negotiable. This will cost me professionally, will cost me personally. I accept that. Because the alternative, continuing to deny truth, continuing to dismiss wisdom simply because it doesn't fit Western empirical frameworks, that cost is higher. To the Blackfeet elder who walked out of my lecture last month, you were right. I was wrong. I'm sorry. To anyone reading this who thinks I've lost my mind, I understand. I would have thought the same thing a week ago. All I can say is, stay humble, stay open. Understand that indigenous peoples across the world have maintained traditions, warnings, and knowledge for thousands of years not because they were ignorant, but because they understood things that modern science is only beginning to glimpse. The Wendigo is real. The spirit world is real. The sacred spaces are real. Deny them at your peril. He posted it. Watch the comment section explode within hours. Former colleagues expressing concern, blog subscribers leaving angry messages, academic contacts quietly distancing themselves. His department chair at Montana State sent a terse email suggesting he take a leave of absence, seek professional help, perhaps reconsider his public statements. Douglas deleted the email and kept writing. About the thin places in Glacier, about the protocols for respecting sacred land, about the importance of listening to indigenous knowledge keepers. The blog lost 90% of its subscribers within a week, but gained different readers, people who'd experienced things they couldn't explain. Native Americans who appreciated seeing their traditions validated by a former skeptic. Researchers working on the edges of consciousness studies, parapsychology, areas where the Western scientific framework began showing cracks. A month after the incident, Douglas received a letter, handwritten, postmarked from the Blackfeet Reservation. Inside, a single sentence in Ojibwe, followed by English translation, "The one who was lost has been found. He walks between worlds now, neither fully spirit nor fully human, but the hunger is bound. Thank you for your humility, Mackenzie. The spirits notice." No signature. Douglas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. The only evidence he kept of the day reality proved more complex than his textbooks admitted. He continued working as a ranger, continued hiking the backcountry, but differently now. With respect. With recognition that the land belonged to something older than the National Park Service, older than the United States, older than European contact. He avoided the thin places when he could, and when he couldn't, when duty required investigating remote areas, when hikers went missing in sections of the park that the Blackfeet specifically warned about. He went prepared not with scientific equipment, but with humility, with tobacco offerings, with acknowledgement that he was a guest in spaces governed by rules he barely understood. Sometimes, hiking alone in the high country, he'd hear the chattering, distant, moving between trees with that impossible gait, the Wendigo or others like it, still walking the mountains, still hunting in the spaces where hunger and cold and violation of taboo created conditions for their existence. But the sound didn't terrify him anymore, just reminded him that he understood almost nothing about the world, and that was okay. That was true. That was the beginning of actual wisdom rather than the false certainty he'd confused with knowledge for so many years. Douglas Mackenzie, former skeptic, former debunker, former rational scientist, walked through the wilderness with open eyes and humble heart, bearing witness to mysteries he'd never solve but could finally respect. The upside-down trees remained in his memory, clearer than any photograph. A reminder that reality was negotiable in the thin places, that the impossible was simply the not yet understood, and that sometimes the only rational response to the truly inexplicable was to admit defeat and keep learning. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. David Ramirez watched a coyote stand upright, shed its skin like a coat, and walk into the moonlight as a man. Not metaphorically. Not hallucination or heat shimmer or misidentified wildlife. The animal's front legs elongated into arms with a sound like green wood splitting, spine cracking vertical with wet pops, fur peeling away in sheets to reveal human musculature beneath. The thing that had been coyote turned its head, still wrong, neck rotating too far, and looked directly at David with eyes that held understanding, malice, and something that might have been recognition. His GoPro Hero 6 captured every frame in 4K clarity. 3 hours earlier, David had been explaining to his YouTube audience why skinwalkers were culturally significant folklore with zero empirical basis. The video, episode 47 of Debunking the Wild, had already garnered 12,000 views and 300 comments, most accusing him of cultural insensitivity. David didn't care. Facts didn't require sensitivity. Science didn't apologize for contradicting superstition. He'd built an entire career on that principle. PhD in environmental science from Berkeley, published author of Myth-Busting the Wilderness, consultant for a dozen television programs dedicated to exposing paranormal fraud. His YouTube channel had 200,000 subscribers who appreciated his methodical destruction of cryptid claims, haunted forest stories, and what he called the profitable ignorance industry. The Navajo skinwalker mythology had been on his list for years. Shape-shifting witches, cursed transformations, all the classic hallmarks of pre-scientific cultures trying to explain the unexplainable. Canyon de Chelly seemed like the perfect location for a definitive takedown. Sacred to the Navajo, steeped in tradition, actively used for ceremonies that park rangers were legally forbidden from documenting. David had spent 6 months negotiating permits, finding a guide willing to take him into restricted areas, arranging permissions that technically didn't allow what he planned to do, but granted enough access to be useful. Jordan Hayes had been that guide. 28 years old, Navajo, raised on the reservation, worked for the National Park Service as a cultural liaison. She'd taken the job reluctantly, made clear her objections to David's disrespectful project, but ultimately accepted because the Park Service had assigned her, and she needed the work. Their relationship had been professionally cold. She'd answered his questions with minimum detail, refused to discuss specific ceremonies, and warned him repeatedly about showing proper respect. "There are places we don't go after dark," she'd said on the second day, pointing toward the canyon's eastern rim where sandstone walls rose 800 feet straight up. Not because of park regulations, because it's not safe. "Bears?" David had asked, knowing the answer. "Worse." He'd smiled, patronizing. "Skinwalkers?" Jordan's expression had gone carefully neutral. People who don't respect warnings tend to find out why they existed. That had been yesterday afternoon. Jordan had left their camp at Spider Rock after dinner, said she needed to perform a blessing before entering certain areas tomorrow. Standard cultural protocol, she'd explained. Would take maybe an hour. David should stay at camp, keep the fire going, not wander off. She hadn't returned. David had waited 2 hours before calling it in to park dispatch. The ranger station had responded with concern but not alarm. Guides sometimes extended ceremonies if the spiritual work required it, sometimes stayed overnight at sacred sites to complete protocols. Give it until morning. If she wasn't back by dawn, they'd initiate search procedures. David had given it until 2 a.m. before his academic ego overruled his common sense. Jordan clearly didn't want him documenting wherever she'd gone, which meant it was probably exactly the kind of authentic ritual site his viewers would love to see debunked. He'd equipped himself with the essentials. Garmin InReach Explorer Plus clipped to his belt, GoPro Hero 6 mounted to his chest harness, iPhone X at 90% battery, Petzl headlamp, and the kind of confidence that came from never encountering anything science couldn't explain. The tracking had been easy. Jordan's footprints in October sand led northeast, away from the established trails, toward the canyon section marked on his maps as culturally sensitive, access restricted. Perfect. David had filmed the entire hike, narrating for his audience about pursuing authentic documentation despite local resistance to scientific inquiry. He'd found Jordan's backpack first, abandoned beside a seep spring, contents scattered like she'd left in a hurry, radio still inside which violated every safety protocol, her GPS unit showing low battery, and carved into the sandstone beside the spring, symbols that David photographed extensively, probably modern graffiti styled to look ancient, he'd theorized to the camera, easy to fake for tourists or, more cynically, to maintain mystique around restricted areas. The coyote had appeared 10 minutes later. David had noticed it watching from a rock outcrop, eyes reflecting his headlamp with that characteristic green shine. Nothing unusual. Coyotes were common in the canyon, especially near water sources. He'd filmed it, zoomed in, started explaining coyote behavior patterns and why primitive cultures might misattribute human characteristics to canid behavior. Then it had stood up. The video showed everything. David had watched it 3 times already, hands shaking, and the footage didn't lie. Couldn't lie. 4K resolution, 60 frames per second, image stabilization compensating for his trembling. The transformation took 18 seconds from first movement to complete human form. The abandoned skin lay on the rock like shed clothes, fur matted and empty. The figure, impossible to call it human despite the shape, descended from the outcrop with movements that suggested recent acquisition of bipedal locomotion, like someone remembering how legs worked. It wore Jordan's face, not perfectly. The proportions were subtly wrong, eyes spaced slightly too far apart, mouth a fraction too wide, but recognizably her features, her build, her hair. It even wore approximations of her clothing, though David's scientific mind couldn't begin to explain how transformation included garment synthesis. Dr. Ramirez, it said. Jordan's voice, but with harmonics underneath, multiple vocal cords producing slightly different frequencies that created a nauseating vibrato. You wanted documentation, are you documenting? David's mouth had gone dry. His hand found the InReach's SOS button, muscle memory from safety training. Press and hold for 3 seconds to activate emergency satellite beacon. Rangers would come. Help would come. This was explainable, had to be explainable. Some kind of elaborate hoax or neurological episode or... The thing wearing Jordan's face moved faster than his eyes could track. One moment 20 feet away, the next directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell something like wet dog mixed with copper. Its hand, too many knuckles, fingers bending backward, closed around his wrist. No calling, it said. Not yet. First you learn. Then you become. David tried to pull away. The grip was absolute, crushing. Bones ground together. His academic brain cataloged the impossibility even through pain. Human grip strength averaged 70-90 psi. This felt like industrial machinery. The thing's other hand reached up, touched his forehead with one elongated finger, and David's world inverted. He was standing on the rock outcrop looking down at himself. No, he was the coyote, brain somehow transplanted into canid neural architecture, experiencing reality through different sensory hierarchies. Smell dominated everything. 1,000 scents painting the canyon in olfactory detail his human consciousness couldn't properly interpret. He tried to scream and produced a yip, tried to run and felt 4 legs responding to instincts he didn't possess. Then he was back in his body, gasping, the thing's hand still touching his forehead. "You understand now," it said, not a question. "Perspective is gift. Flesh is negotiable. Your science has no words for what we are." It released him. David collapsed, GoPro still recording, mind fragmenting, trying to reconcile what he'd experienced. Hallucination. Had to be. Drugged water supply. Jordan dosing him with something hallucinogenic to teach him a lesson about respecting Navajo culture. Except the video would show objective reality when he reviewed it later, would prove whether this was internal or external, subjective or real. The thing smiled with Jordan's mouth. "Real Dr. Ramirez is still alive. For now, she watches from where we put her, conscious, aware, unable to stop us wearing her shape. Would you like to know how that feels? To be passenger in your own flesh?" "This isn't possible," David heard himself say. Academic reflex, clinging to framework. Shape-shifting violates conservation of mass. Energy requirements would be, your physics is description, not prescription. Universe doesn't care about your equations. We existed before your words for us. We'll exist after. The thing tilted its head, still wrong, neck rotating 30 degrees past human range. "You came seeking to debunk. Instead, you'll demonstrate. Your audience will learn truth." It reached for him again. David ran. Pure survival instinct overriding intellect, legs pumping before conscious decision. The canyon at night was maze of shadows and sandstone, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly. Behind him, sounds of pursuit. Not human footsteps, but something that started bipedal and transitioned mid-stride into 4-legged gallop. Coyote again, or something between, hunting with predator efficiency. His in-reach had GPS tracking active. Breadcrumb trail back to camp, clearly marked. David followed it blindly, breath burning in his throat. Altitude and adrenaline combining into physiological emergency. The Garmin showed 0.8 miles to camp. Achievable. Had to be achievable. Something hit him from the side with force that should have shattered ribs. David went down hard, skidded across sand and rock, felt skin tear away from his left arm. The thing landed on his chest, crushing weight, and he was looking up into his own face. Not Jordan's face now. His. Perfect replication down to the 3-day stubble and the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood bicycle accident. The thing wearing his face grinned with his mouth. "Better fit," it said in his voice. "Your shape has power, your authority, your audience." It leaned closer, breath smelling like rotted meat. "We'll use it well." David felt pressure against his consciousness, like someone pushing into a space meant for one. The thing wasn't wearing him yet. It wore his face over its own wrongness, but he could feel intention, preparation, the spiritual equivalent of measuring for clothes. His mind recoiled, pulling inward, and for a moment he felt Jordan's presence. Another consciousness trapped somewhere in the dark, screaming without voice. Then the pressure released. The thing stood, still wearing David's face but body language alien, predatory. "Not ready yet. Need proper ceremony, proper transfer. You'll participate." It gestured toward the canyon rim. "Walk. We'll show you the place." David didn't move. Couldn't. Fear had locked his muscles, academic framework completely shattered. Everything he'd built his career on, material realism, empirical methodology, scientific naturalism, lay in ruins. This thing existed, violated every law he knew, and wore faces like masks, could apparently transfer consciousness, operated on rules that physics didn't account for. "Walk," it repeated, still using his voice. "Or we take your shape now, incomplete, and you spend eternity aware but unable to control even your breathing." He walked. The path led to structures David hadn't seen on any maps. Ancient, ancestral Puebloan, maybe, or older. Stone rooms built into the canyon wall, accessible only via hand-carved ladder rungs that had to be centuries old. The thing climbed with disturbing agility, David's face grinning down at him from above, beckoning. Inside the largest room, David found what was left of Jordan Hayes. She sat against the far wall, physically intact but eyes rolled back, breathing shallow. Alive, conscious in some nightmare sense, trapped behind her own eyes while something else operated her flesh from outside. Her fingers twitched occasionally, attempts at movement that never completed. Drool ran from one corner of her mouth. "She fights still," the thing said, David's voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Strong will, but will doesn't matter. We took her at the spring, during blessing, interrupted the protection ceremony. Easy then. Opened, vulnerable, spirit outward focused. We stepped in. She's been watching us use her for hours. Fascinating, the human mind. Doesn't break, just compresses, makes room." David knelt beside Jordan, checked her pulse. Strong. Steady. Medically, she appeared fine. Just absent. Evicted from herself. His hands shook, touching her wrist. The GoPro continued recording everything, the thing said. "Document it. Show your audience. They should understand what happens to those who disrespect sacred boundaries. You came seeking truth. This is truth. We are Yi Nald Lushi, skinwalkers in your language. We violated taboos to gain this power, killed close kin, performed forbidden ceremonies, spoke words that shouldn't be spoken, and we received gift of flesh change, skinwalk, body theft. We are Navajo tradition's warning made manifest." It crouched beside David, still wearing his face, close enough that he could see the wrongness in the eyes, pupils that didn't quite dilate correctly, capillaries arranged in subtly non-human patterns. "You spend career explaining away mystery. Now mystery explains you away. You'll be vessel. We'll use your authority, your platform, your 200,000 followers. Spread truth. Show them real transformation. Live on camera. They'll watch Dr. David Ramirez become something else. Perfect documentation." David's mind raced through options. Attack. Futile. The thing had already demonstrated impossible strength. Run. Where? It could track, could chase in forms faster than human. Call for help. His in-reach was gone, must have fallen during the chase. iPhone still in his pocket, but no signal this deep in the canyon. The GoPro recorded everything but couldn't transmit. Footage would only exist if he survived to retrieve it. "When?" he asked. Stalling. Trying to think. "Dawn. Need sunrise for proper ceremony. Transfer works best with solar transition. Darkness to light. Old flesh to new. You have maybe 2 hours. Should prepare. Make peace. Say goodbye to being singular." The thing stood, walked to the chamber entrance, stood silhouetted against night sky. "We'll wait outside. Give you time with the guide. She can't speak, but she hears. Might want to apologize for the disrespect. For the mockery. For learning too late that some traditions exist for reasons beyond superstition." It left. David heard it moving on the ledge outside, pacing, patient. Jordan's eyes tracked him. Aware. Imprisoned. David moved directly into her line of sight, made sure the GoPro captured both of them clearly. If this footage survived, if someone found it, they needed to understand. "I'm sorry," he said. Inadequate. Meaningless. "You warned me. I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. Thought science had all the answers. I was wrong. So completely wrong." Jordan's finger twitched. Deliberate. 3 taps against the stone floor. Conscious communication, using the minimal control she still possessed. David watched carefully. 3 more taps. Pattern emerging. Morse code? No, simpler. She was pointing, subtle movement, toward something behind him. David turned. The chamber's back wall showed more carvings. Not graffiti, genuine ancient work, deeper and more weathered than the symbols at the spring. He'd dismissed them earlier as anthropologically interesting but irrelevant. Now, studying them with the GoPro's light, he recognized Navajo iconography he'd seen in academic journals, protection symbols, binding patterns. And at the center, instructions in what looked like Spanish influenced by indigenous language, colonial-era translation of indigenous practice. The text described containment, how to trap Yi Naldlushi using their own power against them, required specific components, silver, sage, and most critically, the Skinwalker's true name spoken at moment of transformation, the name they'd possessed before the taboo, before the violation, when they were still human. Speak it during flesh change and the process would reverse, tear them back into original form, bind them there permanently. David's academic training kicked in despite terror. This was ethnographic data, cultural knowledge preserved across centuries. The colonial Spaniards who'd recorded it must have witnessed Skinwalker activity, documented Navajo defensive practices. The instructions were precise, detailed, written by someone who'd seen these methods work. Silver. He had his belt buckle, gift from his ex-wife, sterling silver. Sage, none available, but perhaps not strictly necessary given the specificity of other requirements. The true name. That was the problem. How could he possibly know what this thing had been called before its transformation, before it became something else? Jordan's eyes widened. She'd watched him read, understood his thoughts. Her finger began moving again, dragging through the dust coating the stone floor. Letters, painfully slow, fighting whatever possessed her for every motion. D-A-H. The thing returned before she could finish. "Time to prepare," it announced. David's voice cheerful, obscene given context. "Ceremony requires specific arrangement. You'll kneel here. We'll stand behind. At sunrise we speak words, perform transfer. Your consciousness goes into darkness. Ours takes your flesh. Simple, elegant. Your followers watch the best episode of Debunking the Wild ever produced. The debunker debunked, remade, improved." It pulled David to his feet, positioned him at the chamber's center, directly beneath the opening in the roof where sunrise would enter. The sky beyond was showing first gray hints of coming dawn. Maybe 40 minutes left. "Any final scientific observations?" the thing asked, mockery evident. "Any equations to explain this? Theories to encompass your upcoming transformation? Perhaps YouTube comment about how it's all camera tricks and clever editing?" David's hand found his belt buckle. Silver. Real. He unfastened it slowly, pretending to adjust his pants, palming the metal. The thing watched but didn't seem concerned. What threat could belt buckle possibly pose? Jordan's finger continued moving in the dust. D-A-H-Y-I. "What was your name?" David asked suddenly. "Before, when you were human, before you chose this." The thing laughed. His laugh. "Bold question for someone about to cease existing. Names have power. We don't share. Navajo tradition says skinwalkers were people once. You had family, community, identity. What did they call you?" "They called us traitor. Witch. Violator of sacred law. We killed them. All. Took their skins too, eventually. Whole bloodline erased so no one could speak the name that bound us." The thing crouched beside him, David's face centimeters from his own. "You'll never know it. Your bargaining position is 0. Your life ends at sunrise regardless." Jordan's hand completed the word. Da-yi-itso-h. David saw it in peripheral vision, letters in dust barely visible in pre-dawn light. Da-yi-itso, Navajo name, probably translating to something specific, some characteristic or family designation. Jordan somehow knew it, must have recognized this particular skinwalker from tribal history, from warnings passed down through generations. He had the name, had silver, needed only to wait for the transformation moment, for the instant when the thing transferred from its current shape into complete occupation of David's body. The instructions specified moment of flesh change, the ceremony's peak, when one form released and another assumed, when the skinwalker was most vulnerable. Dawn crept closer. The thing began positioning itself behind David, hands on his shoulders, chanting in language David didn't recognize. Navajo words corrupted, twisted, used for purposes opposite their original intent. He could feel the pressure again, consciousness invasion beginning, probing at the edges of his mind seeking entry points. The silver belt buckle pressed against his palm. David closed his eyes, trying to center himself, maintain identity boundaries against the incoming tide. The thing's chanting intensified. Sunrise touched the chamber's eastern edge. David felt himself beginning to compress. Jordan had been right. The mind didn't break. It made room, consciousness squeezing into smaller and smaller space as something vast and alien pushed inward. He could feel the thing's memories bleeding in. Centuries of wearing different skins. Hunting. Killing. The sensation of flesh reshaping itself according to will. Horror and violation and... He spoke the name. Dahitso. The chanting stopped. Pressure halted. David opened his eyes. The thing stood frozen behind him, hands still on his shoulders but grip loosening. He twisted, drove the silver belt buckle upward, caught the thing in the solar plexus. Not a killing blow. Didn't need to be. The silver made contact during interrupted transformation, name spoken at the moment of vulnerability. The thing's face, David's face, began melting. Not metaphor. Actual liquefaction. Flesh running like wax, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. The features twisted, inverted, reformed into something that might have been human once, decades or centuries ago, before the taboos and ceremonies and violations. The body followed, collapsing, reshaping, extracting itself from stolen form like someone pulling free of tight clothing. What remained was withered, ancient, barely human. Male, David thought, though age and transformation had rendered sex nearly indeterminate. Navajo features visible beneath the corruption, and in its eyes, no longer wrong, no longer alien, pure human terror, trapped, bound, reduced to original flesh that could no longer change, no longer escape. Jordan gasped. Actual vocalization, her own voice. The possession had released when the skinwalker's power broke. She was sobbing, hands covering her face, whole body shaking with restored autonomy. David caught her before she collapsed. "You're back. You're you again. It's over." The withered thing on the floor hissed, trying to speak but voice failing. Centuries compressed into mortal frame, aging catching up instantly. David watched it deteriorate in real time, flesh mummifying, bones becoming visible, the price of prolonged unnatural existence coming due all at once. Within minutes, only desiccated corpse remained, barely recognizable as once human. The GoPro had captured everything, every frame, proof, documentation, exactly what David had come seeking, though not the debunking he'd intended. Jordan recovered enough to move after 10 minutes. They helped each other down the ladder rungs, back toward the canyon floor. Sunrise fully arrived and ordinary. The GoPro came with them. So did Jordan's radio, retrieved from her scattered pack. Signal at the canyon floor was sufficient for emergency call to park rangers. The official story would be simpler than truth. Jordan had gotten injured during night blessing. David had found her, helped her until morning, called for extraction. The abandoned ceremonial site would be noted and marked for cultural preservation. The footage on David's GoPro would never be published, at least not the transformation segments. Some things didn't need sharing. David kept watching the video, though. Private viewing, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The thing wearing his face, Jordan trapped behind her own eyes, the moment of transformation and binding. His academic framework hadn't just failed, it had been revealed as fundamentally incomplete. The universe was stranger than his equations allowed. He never posted another Debunking the Wild episode. The YouTube channel went dark without explanation. 200,000 subscribers waited for content that would never come. His book publisher kept calling about the follow-up to Myth-Busting the Wilderness. David let calls go to voicemail. Jordan returned to work after 2 weeks medical leave, officially recovering from dehydration and exposure. She avoided David when their paths crossed at the park. Didn't blame him exactly. but couldn't look at him without remembering what it felt like to be passenger in her own flesh. Some violations left marks invisible to medical examination. David stayed in Arizona. Couldn't say why. Should have left, gone back to Berkeley, resumed the academic career that was now effectively over. Instead, he rented a house on the reservation border, started learning Navajo language from online resources, reading anthropological accounts he'd previously dismissed as contaminated by cultural bias. The GoPro footage stayed on his laptop, encrypted, password protected. Sometimes late at night he'd watch the transformation segments again, studying the moment when coyote became man, when impossibility became documented reality. His scientific training insisted on analysis, on understanding, but some phenomena existed beyond measurement, beyond equations that could contain them. 6 months after the incident, David received a package at his Arizona address. No return label. Inside, a single item. The belt buckle, sterling silver, tarnished black around the edges where it had touched the skinwalker's flesh during binding. He'd left it in the chamber that morning, hadn't thought to retrieve it. Accompanying note, handwritten in neat script. Some disrespect can be forgiven. Some lessons have value. Wear this. Remember what you learned. Jordan. David wore it daily. Reminder and protection both. The Navajo he'd met around town noticed, recognized the significance. A belt buckle that had bound Yinaldlushi carried power, warded against certain dangers. People started treating him differently. Not friendly exactly, but respectful. The academic who'd learned humility the hard way. The skeptic who'd encountered proof and had the wisdom to stop publicizing things better left unknown. He thought about Jordan often, about those hours she'd spent imprisoned in her own body, aware but powerless, watching the skinwalker use her face and voice. About the compressed consciousness, the making room, the violation of self that medical science had no vocabulary for. Some traumas didn't show on CT scans, didn't respond to pharmacology. The GoPro sat in his desk drawer, turned off, dead battery. David never charged it again. The footage existed, irrefutable documentation of supernatural transformation, shape-shifting, possession. Everything his career had been built on denying. He could release it, prove he'd been right to change position, force the scientific community to acknowledge phenomena outside their paradigm. He didn't. Some knowledge wasn't meant for mass distribution. Some truths caused more damage than ignorance. The Navajo had kept skinwalker knowledge carefully contained for centuries, speaking of it only in warnings, only to those who needed to understand boundaries. David had violated those boundaries through arrogance and intellectual pride. Publishing footage would be repeating the same violation at larger scale. Instead, he wrote, private journals, not for publication. Documentation for himself. Attempts to reconcile scientific training with experienced reality. The equation still worked for what they'd always described: material interactions, energy exchanges, conservation laws. But they were incomplete. Left out consciousness, spirit, the malleable nature of identity and flesh under certain conditions. Jordan called once 3 months after the package. Brief conversation, mostly awkward silence. She asked what he'd done with the footage. David told her it was encrypted, private, wouldn't be shared. She said thank you, hung up. He never heard from her again, but sometimes saw her in the distance when visiting Canyon de Chelly as regular tourist, respecting boundaries, never entering restricted areas. His YouTube channel's comment section filled with speculation. Where was Dr. Ramirez? What happened to him? Some conspiracy theories emerged. Government suppression. He'd encountered real phenomenon and been silenced. He'd been replaced by men in black. Others assumed simpler explanations. Burnout, personal crisis, fraud exposure. All wrong, all right. David Ramirez, who'd climbed that ladder into the ceremonial chamber, was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned the wrong lesson at exactly the right time. Not replaced by Skinwalker, but transformed nonetheless. From arrogant skeptic to chastened witness, from debunker to believer in boundaries, from someone who thought science held all answers to someone who understood questions mattered more than solutions. He still watched the transformation sometimes. Late nights alone, the video that proved everything and meant nothing. The coyote standing upright, flesh peeling away. Jordan's face worn like mask, his own face reflected back with wrong eyes. The moment he'd witnessed impossible and survived only through knowledge he'd previously mocked. The silver belt buckle grew heavier with time, or perhaps he simply became more aware of its weight, reminder and protection, proof and warning. Some nights he'd touch it, remember the feel of driving it into the skinwalker's chest, speaking the name that bound and broke. Remember Jordan's eyes, trapped behind her own face, aware and helpless. Remember that science described one kind of reality but not all reality, that equations were tools not totality, that indigenous knowledge preserved across centuries carried weight earned through terrible experience. The canyon remained. The sacred sites endured. The boundaries stayed marked for those willing to see them, and David Ramirez wore his silver buckle, carried his encrypted footage, and understood that some debunking proved only the debunker's ignorance, that some mysteries preserved civilization rather than challenged it, that respect for tradition wasn't about belief but about recognizing that ancestors learned through suffering what shouldn't be relearned through arrogance. The GoPro stayed in the drawer. The YouTube channel stayed dark. The 200,000 subscribers eventually stopped waiting. And somewhere in Canyon de Chelly, in places marked culturally sensitive, in rooms carved into sandstone walls, the protective symbols kept watching, kept warning, kept marking boundaries between what should be known and what was better left mysterious. David had come seeking to debunk. Instead, he documented his own transformation, not into Skinwalker but into something rarer, a scientist who'd encountered the limits of science and had wisdom enough to stop pushing. The belt buckle remained. The memory remained. The footage remained. And some nights, David could still feel it, that pressure against consciousness, that sensation of something vast trying to push inward, making room where room shouldn't exist. Jordan lived with it constantly, he knew. The ghost of possession, the memory of being passenger. He'd gotten off easy, kept his flesh, kept his self, learned without losing everything. Jordan had paid the real price, and the withered thing that had been Daiitso had paid most of all. Centuries of stolen life compressed into mortal aging in minutes, power stripped, bound to dying flesh it could no longer escape. The GoPro captured it all. Truth in 4K resolution. Evidence that would convince no one, because convincing wasn't the point. Understanding was the point. Respect was the point. Knowing when to stop was the point. David Ramirez learned those lessons in a stone chamber in Canyon de Chelly. Learned them with sterling silver and a skinwalker's true name. Learned them watching his own face worn wrong by something that shouldn't exist but did. The footage stayed encrypted. The channel stayed dark. The belt buckle stayed heavy. And the boundaries stayed marked, waiting for the next arrogant skeptic who thought science could explain away mystery, debunk tradition, rationalize the irrational. David hoped they'd be smarter than he was. Doubted they would be. Arrogance, he'd learned, was the most persistent human trait. The GoPro recorded everything. But wisdom was knowing what not to show. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Gregory Hansen had stopped writing the blog post mid-sentence, his fingers frozen above his laptop keyboard, because the tree outside his ranger station window was growing. Not slowly, not imperceptibly like normal biological growth, but visibly. The lodgepole pine's trunk expanding, bark splitting, branches extending upward 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet in the span of 30 seconds. He watched the impossible growth accelerate until the tree was 20 feet taller than it had been when he'd started typing, its new branches reaching toward his window like grasping fingers. Then it stopped, perfectly still, as if it had always been that height. Hansen's laptop screen still showed his half-finished article, debunking the Wendigo myth, why Algonquian horror stories are just starvation hallucinations. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The tree remained impossibly tall, its shadow now stretching across the entire parking lot where moments ago it had barely reached the first parking space. Hansen stood from his desk, moved to the window, pressed his face close to the glass. The bark showed fresh growth rings exposed where it had split during expansion, sap still oozing from the cracks. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a trick of perspective or fatigue-induced misperception. He just watched a tree grow 20 feet in less than a minute. Hansen grabbed his Nikon D90, rushed outside into the late June afternoon. The Montana sun blazed overhead, temperature pushing 80 degrees, but when he stepped into the tree's new shadow, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an instant. His breath misted. Frost formed on the ranger station's siding where the shadow touched it. He photographed the tree from multiple angles, hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, he told himself, but from excitement. This was documentation of an anomaly, a natural phenomenon science hadn't yet explained. There would be a rational explanation. There always was. The Garmin GPS map 60 CSX on his belt showed the time as 3:47 p.m., elevation 3,458 feet, coordinates 48.6951 degree N, 113.8168 degree W, the ranger station at the Avalanche Creek trailhead in Glacier National Park. Everything normal except the impossible tree and the freezing shadow. Hansen's Motorola radio crackled. "Hansen, this is dispatch. We've got a hiker overdue on the trail of the Cedars Loop. Jordan Hayes, solo day hiker. Permit shows expected return by 2 p.m. Vehicle still in parking lot. Can you initiate a hasty search?" He pressed the transmit button, still staring at the tree. "Copy that. Give me the details." The dispatcher, a veteran named Rodriguez, provided the information. Jordan Hayes, 29 years old, experienced hiker from Seattle, checked in at 9 a.m. for the 4-mile loop trail. Should have been back hours ago. No response to calls, no sign at the vehicle. "I'll head out now," Hansen said. He grabbed his pack from the station, loaded it with standard SR gear, first aid kit, extra water, emergency beacon, headlamp. His mind was still processing the tree, trying to construct a framework that would explain both the growth and the cold. Localized temperature inversion? Impossible. Those didn't create 40-degree drops in shadow versus sunlight. Optical illusion combined with confirmation bias. But he had photographs, measurements, documentation. Seismic activity causing ground shift that elevated the tree? Ridiculous. The surrounding ground showed no disturbance. He started up the trail of the cedars, following the well-maintained boardwalk that wound through old-growth western red cedar and hemlock. The trail was popular, easy, heavily trafficked. People didn't vanish on trails like this. They twisted ankles, got turned around in side paths, sat down to rest and lost track of time. Simple, rational explanations. The forest here was magnificent. Trees 500 years old, some with trunks 10 feet across, the canopy creating cathedral-like spaces filled with filtered green light. Hansen had spent 3 months at Glacier National Park, transferred from Yellowstone specifically to investigate reports of unusual phenomena that he'd planned to systematically debunk for his blog and eventual book, Rational Ranger, Debunking America's Wilderness Myths. His blog had 40,000 followers who appreciated his no-nonsense approach to the supernatural claims that plagued park rangers nationwide. He'd already written pieces dismantling Bigfoot sightings, misidentified bears, ghost stories, pareidolia, and infrasound, and UFO reports, Venus, satellites, drones. The Wendigo piece was going to be his masterwork, a thorough takedown of how starvation, hypothermia, and isolation created the myth of the cannibal spirit. Except he'd just watched a tree grow 20 feet in 30 seconds. Hansen reached the point where the boardwalk loop split toward Avalanche Lake. He called Hayes' name, listening for response. Nothing but wind through cedars and the distant rush of Avalanche Creek. He checked his GPS. The loop was only 4 miles. Hayes should have completed it hours ago, even walking slowly. He continued searching, finding nothing unusual until he reached the far side of the loop, where the maintained trail passed close to a drainage ravine. There, on the boardwalk, he found Jordan Hayes' day pack. Hansen photographed it in place before examining it. Quality Osprey pack, waist straps unbuckled as if it had been set down deliberately rather than dropped. Inside, water bottle half full, trail mix, first aid kit, wallet with Hayes' ID and credit cards, cell phone at 47% battery. Everything you'd expect from an experienced day hiker, everything except the hiker. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I found Hayes' pack on the Trail of the Cedars, approximately 2.3 miles from Trailhead. No sign of Hayes. Pack appears to have been set down intentionally. Initiating expanded search." "Copy," Rodriguez said. "Do you need additional personnel?" Hansen looked at the forest surrounding the trail, thick undergrowth, deadfall, the ravine dropping away steeply to the creek below. "Affirmative. Send 2 more rangers and notify SAR. This is now a missing person case." He secured the pack, marked the location with flagging tape, and began a careful search pattern radiating from the discovery point. The rational part of his brain, the PhD in ecology, the published researcher, cataloged possibilities. Hayes had left the pack to investigate something, got disoriented, fell into the ravine, medical emergency, sudden confusion, wandered off trail, animal encounter causing panic flight. But another part of his brain, a part he'd spent years training himself to ignore, kept returning to the tree, to the impossible growth, to the cold shadow. He found the first footprint 20 feet off the trail, in soft earth near the ravine edge. Definitely human, boot tread consistent with hiking footwear, heading downslope toward the creek. He followed, finding more prints, a clear trail descending into the ravine. Then the prints changed. Hansen stopped, crouching to examine the tracks more carefully. The boot prints continued, but between them, pressing into the soil around them, were other impressions, larger, deeper. The shape was wrong, elongated, narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the front. But the spacing suggested a bipedal gait, something walking upright alongside Hayes. He photographed the prints, measured them, 14 inches long, 4 inches wide at the widest point. No animal in Glacier had feet that size with that shape. Grizzly tracks were massive, but completely different morphology. Mountain lion, wolf, elk, nothing matched. The rational explanation was that these were older prints, unrelated to Hayes' trail. Overlapping tracks from different times creating confusing patterns, except the soil consistency was identical, the weathering the same, and the spacing showed clear simultaneous progression down the slope. Hansen continued following the tracks into the ravine. The temperature dropped with each step downward, becoming noticeably colder despite the June heat. By the time he reached Avalanche Creek, his breath was misting again, and frost clung to the vegetation along the water's edge. The tracks led directly to the creek's edge, then vanished. No sign of crossing, no continuation on the opposite bank, nothing. Just an abrupt termination at the water. Hansen stood at the creek's edge, trying to process what he was seeing. The water was glacial runoff, painfully cold even in summer, running fast over smooth stones. A person could cross it. The water was only knee-deep here, but it would be uncomfortable and dangerous. Why would Hayes leave the maintained trail, descend into a ravine, and cross a freezing creek for no apparent reason? He was about to radio his findings when he noticed the trees. Every tree within a 50-foot radius of where he stood had markings carved into the bark. Not random vandalism or trailblazes. These were symbols, intricate geometric patterns cut deep into the wood, and they all showed fresh sap, recent cutting. Hansen approached the nearest marked cedar. The symbol was complex, 3 circles interconnected by lines, surrounded by what looked like stylized representations of hands or claws. He'd seen similar patterns before, in anthropology textbooks, in museum exhibits on indigenous cultures, Algonquian protective symbols, wards against evil spirits, against the Wendigo. His radio crackled with static, then Rodriguez's voice. "Hansen, additional rangers en route. ETA 20 minutes. What's your status?" Hansen pressed transmit. "I'm in the Avalanche Creek drainage. I've found tracks and unusual markings. Rodriguez, has there been any recent cultural activity in this area? Indigenous ceremonies, traditional practices?" A pause. Not that I'm aware of. Why? Because someone's been carving protective symbols into trees down here, recently. Another pause. Longer. Hansen, the Blackfeet consider this area significant, but official ceremonies would go through proper channels. What you're describing sounds like the transmission dissolved into static, harsh and sudden. Hansen tried different channels, got nothing but white noise. He checked his GPS. Signal was weak but present. He tried his cell phone, no coverage, which was normal this deep in the park. He was alone in a ravine, following tracks that didn't make sense, surrounded by protective symbols carved by someone who apparently believed in the exact myth Hansen had been writing an article debunking when his tree grew 20 feet in 30 seconds. The temperature continued dropping. Hansen could see his breath now in thick clouds, could feel the cold seeping through his uniform. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a microclimate or temperature inversion or any rational meteorological phenomenon. This was wrong in a fundamental way that his PhD and his publications and his 40,000 blog followers couldn't explain away. He heard the whisper. Not a word, exactly. More like wind through branches, but forming shapes that almost resembled language. Hansen turned slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing visible. Just trees and shadows and the creek's constant rush. The whisper came again from a different direction. This time he caught fragments that sounded like syllables. Wichtiko, the Ojibwe word for wendigo. Who's there? Hansen called out, hating how his voice cracked slightly. This is Park Ranger Gregory Hansen. Identify yourself. No response except the whisper again, now from behind him. Wechuj. Another variant, this one Cree. Hansen's hands were shaking as he pulled out his digital camera, switching it to video mode. If he was experiencing auditory hallucinations, at least he could review the footage later, establish whether sounds were real or psychogenic. He pointed the camera toward the whisper's source, pressed record. The camera's screen showed the forest in full color, every detail crisp. But in the frame, visible on the LCD but not to his naked eye, shadows were moving. Not shadow in the sense of absence of light, but shadow as substance, as entity, dark forms that flowed between trees like liquid, that reached and grasped with appendages that had too many joints. Hansen lowered the camera, looked at the same spot with unaugmented vision. Normal forest. Raised the camera again. Shadow entities, clearly visible through the lens. No, he said aloud. No, this is equipment malfunction. Digital artifacts, lens flare, something rational. The camera's screen flickered and for one frame, 1/30th of a second, showed something else entirely. A figure standing at the creek's edge where Hansen had seen the tracks terminate. Impossibly tall, impossibly thin, skeletal limbs extending far beyond human proportion. The face was a skull, elongated vertically, jaw distended, eyes sunken pits that somehow still conveyed hunger. Then the screen went black. The camera died, battery draining from full charge to zero in an instant. Hansen dropped the camera, stumbled backward, his rational mind fragmenting against the evidence his senses were providing. He pulled out his backup flashlight, switched it on. The beam was weak, yellowed, as if the batteries were dying despite being fresh that morning. The whispers surrounded him now, coming from all directions, the Algonquian words weaving together. Widiko, Wechuge, Wendigo. And beneath the whispers, another sound. Breathing, ragged, wet, like lungs damaged beyond function but still trying to draw air. Getting closer. Hansen ran. He scrambled up the ravine slope, grabbing roots and rocks for purchase, his pack slamming against his back. The rational voice in his head screamed that running was stupid, that he was a trained park ranger, that there had to be an explanation, but a deeper, older part of his brain, the part that had kept humans alive for millions of years before science and rationality, knew predation when it felt it. Behind him, the breathing became footsteps. Heavy, uneven, the sound of something large moving through undergrowth with total disregard for obstacles. Hansen didn't look back. Looking back in horror movies was how people died, and some deep part of him understood that the rules had changed, that he was in a story now where the myths were real. He reached the trail, turned toward the ranger station, kept running. His lungs burned. His legs felt leaden. The cold was everywhere now, not just in shadows but permeating the air, turning the June afternoon into something that felt like deep winter. A branch exploded to his left, torn from a cedar tree by something he couldn't see. The branch was 6 inches thick, ripped away like it was paper. Hansen pushed harder, his vision tunneling, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. The boardwalk appeared ahead. Civilization, maintenance, safety. He reached it, his boots thundering on the wooden planks. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. He risked a glance back, still running. The forest behind him looked normal. Afternoon sunlight filtering through cedars. No movement, no entities, no impossible predators. Just beautiful wilderness. Then he saw it, at the very edge of the tree line where forest met maintained trail. A shape that his mind refused to process correctly, sliding around the edges of perception like water off glass. Tall, skeletal, watching. Hansen turned forward again and ran until he reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind him, throwing the bolt, pressing his back against the wood as if 6 feet of hollow core door could protect him from whatever was out there. His laptop still sat on the desk, screen dark. He moved to it with trembling hands, woke it up. His half-finished blog post stared back at him. Debunking the Wendigo myth. Why Algonquian horror stories are just starvation hallucinations. He laughed, a sound that came out too high, too brittle. Then he selected all the text and deleted it. His Motorola radio buzzed. "Hansen, this is Rodriguez. Your transmission cut out. What's your status? Did you find Hayes?" Hansen stared at the radio for a long moment before picking it up. How did he explain what he'd seen, what he'd experienced? He was Gregory Hansen, PhD in ecology, published author, rational skeptic. His entire professional identity was built on debunking exactly this kind of thing. "Hansen, respond," Rodriguez said, concern creeping into her voice. He pressed transmit. "I'm at the station. Rodriguez, I need you to pull historical records on disappearances in the Avalanche Creek drainage. All of them, going back as far as we have documentation." "What? Why?" "Just do it. Please. And send those additional rangers to the trailhead, but tell them not to go into the drainage. Not until we have more daylight and better equipment." "Hansen, you're not making sense. Are you injured?" "No," he said. "Not injured. Just fundamentally wrong about a lot of things. I'll explain when you get here. How long for those rangers?" 15 minutes. "Copy. I'll be here." He set down the radio and looked at the tree outside his window. It was still impossibly tall, its shadow still impossibly cold. Evidence that reality operated on principles his education hadn't prepared him for. Hansen opened a new document on his laptop and began typing. Not a blog post, not a debunking article, a report, clinical and detailed, documenting everything he'd witnessed. If he was losing his mind, at least there would be a record of the progression. If he wasn't, if what he'd seen was real, then someone needed to know. He titled the document, "Incident Report, Jordan Hayes Missing Person Case, Preliminary Findings and Unexplained Phenomena." Then he added, after a moment's hesitation, "The Wendigo Hypothesis." The words looked absurd on screen. Gregory Hansen, PhD, was seriously proposing that a missing hiker case involved a cannibal spirit from Algonquian mythology. His academic colleagues would crucify him. His blog followers would think he'd had a breakdown. His publisher would cancel his book contract. But he'd watched a tree grow 20 feet in 30 seconds. He'd seen shadows move with intent. He'd glimpsed something at the tree line that his mind still refused to properly process. And Jordan Hayes was still missing. The Rangers arrived 23 minutes later. 2 men Hansen knew casually, Morrison and Blake, both with 10-plus years at Glacier. They found him sitting at his desk, surrounded by printed historical documents Rodriguez had sent via email, his laptop showing topographical maps marked with incident locations. "Hansen," Morrison said carefully, Rodriguez said you found Hayes's pack, but not Hayes, and that you were concerned about something. Hansen gestured to the documents. How much do you know about the disappearances in this area? Morrison and Blake exchanged glances. There have been a few over the years, Blake said. This is wilderness, sometimes people don't come back. 14, Hansen said. 14 disappearances in the Avalanche Creek drainage specifically, going back to 1937 when the park was established, all between late May and early July. All experienced hikers. None of the bodies ever recovered. Okay, Morrison said slowly. That's concerning, but not necessarily anomalous. This is grizzly country. There are cliffs, the creek runs fast during snowmelt. They all reported experiencing extreme cold before vanishing, Hansen interrupted. At least the ones who had time to report anything. Park records show radio calls mentioning temperature drops, frost in June, ice forming on equipment. One ranger in 1983 radioed that his thermometer showed negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 p.m. on June 18th, sunny day. No weather systems in the area. Blake frowned. Could be equipment failure. 14 times? Across 8 decades? With different equipment? Hansen shook his head. And that's not all. Look at this. He pulled up a scanned document from 1967, a report written by a ranger named Samuel Cooper. Cooper was searching for a missing hiker named David Marsh. He described finding protective symbols carved by local tribe members around the drainage area. He interviewed a Blackfeet elder who told him the area was forbidden, that there was a Wendigo, that hunted there during the early summer months when it would be strong enough to manifest. Local legend, Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Cooper recommended the area be closed to public access, Hansen continued. His recommendation was denied. He resigned from the Park Service 3 months later. I found his obituary. He died in 1995, but before he died, he published a book called Sacred Spaces and Forbidden Grounds. There's a whole chapter on this drainage, on the Wendigo. Blake sat down slowly. Hansen, you're not seriously suggesting? I don't know what I'm suggesting, Hansen said. I'm telling you what I found, and I'm telling you I experienced something down in that drainage that I can't explain. Temperature anomalies, auditory phenomena, visual. He stopped, remembering the shadow entities visible only through his camera. Look, I know how this sounds. I know what I would have said 3 hours ago if someone had told me this. But Jordan Hayes is missing, and there's a pattern here that we can't ignore. Morrison picked up one of the documents, scanning it. Even if we take this seriously, and I'm not saying we should, what are you proposing? That we tell search and rescue to look for a cannibal spirit? I'm proposing we contact the Blackfeet Nation, Hansen said. This is their traditional land. If there's cultural knowledge about this area, about the dangers, we need to hear it. And I'm proposing we don't send anyone else into that drainage until we understand what we're dealing with. We have a missing hiker, Blake said. We can't just abandon the search because of old stories and cold spots. I'm not saying abandon it, Hansen said. I'm saying we need more information before we risk more people. Rodriguez, are you still on radio? The radio on his desk crackled. I'm here, and I've been listening. Hansen, I pulled the full records like you asked. There's something else. Every single disappearance happened during a new moon phase. Every one. The 3 rangers looked at each other. Hansen pulled up his phone's weather app, checked the lunar calendar. When's the next new moon? Tonight, Rodriguez said quietly. New moon is tonight. The silence in the ranger station stretched. Outside the window, the afternoon sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks, maybe 4 hours of daylight left. And then darkness, complete darkness, no moon to provide even minimal illumination. We need to find Hayes before nightfall, Hansen said, and we need help. Morrison stood. I'll call search and rescue, get a full team mobilized. And I'll contact the Blackfeet Nation Liaison Office, Blake added. See if someone can come out, provide cultural context. Hansen nodded, grateful they were taking him seriously despite how insane this all sounded. I'm going back to the drainage in daylight with proper equipment. If Hayes is injured down there, time matters. Not alone, Morrison said. We go together. Full SAR protocols, constant radio contact, out before dark. They geared up quickly. Full packs, emergency beacons, extra batteries, flares, first aid equipment. Hansen added one more item, a small digital recorder. If he heard whispers again, he wanted audio documentation. They reached the point where Hansen had found Hayes' pack by 5:15 p.m. The pack was exactly as he'd left it, but the flagging tape he'd used to mark the location had been torn down, shredded into pieces and scattered across the boardwalk. Wind? Blake suggested without conviction. Hansen pointed to the trees. No movement, no breeze. The forest was utterly still. They descended into the ravine together, following the tracks Hansen had documented earlier. The boot prints were still there, and so were the other impressions, the elongated clawed prints that didn't match any known animal. Morrison photographed them extensively. "I've been a ranger for 12 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen tracks like this." The protective symbols were still carved into the trees, and in the late afternoon light they seemed to pulse slightly, the fresh sap catching the sun and gleaming. Blake touched one of the carvings, traced the pattern with his finger. "This is traditional," he said. "I'm not an expert, but I've seen similar symbols at cultural sites. This is real indigenous artwork, not vandalism." They reached the creek's edge where the tracks terminated. The temperature had dropped again. Hansen's breath misted, and frost was forming on the rocks along the water's edge despite the June warmth elsewhere. "This is wrong," Morrison said, checking his thermometer. "I'm reading 38 degrees here. It's 75 at the trailhead." Hansen was about to respond when he heard it again. The whisper, the Algonquian words weaving through the trees. This time all three rangers heard it. "What is that?" Blake whispered. Hansen pulled out his digital recorder, hit record, held it up toward the sound. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now they were forming sentences in a language Hansen didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Then Morrison grabbed his arm, pointed across the creek. On the opposite bank, partially obscured by vegetation, was a shelter. Not a tent or tarp, a structure made of branches and bark, woven together in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. And hanging from the shelter's entrance, swaying slightly despite the lack of wind, was clothing. A jacket. A Seattle Seahawks jacket, consistent with what Hayes' vehicle registration listed as the hiker's vehicle description, which would have matched personal effects. "Hayes," Blake said. He started toward the creek. "Wait," Hansen said, grabbing his arm. "Something's wrong. Why would Hayes build a shelter? The trail is right there. The ranger station is 4 miles away. This doesn't make sense." But Blake was already crossing the creek, water splashing up to his knees, moving toward the shelter. Morrison followed, leaving Hansen on the bank. "Guys, wait," Hansen called. "We need to think about this. The pattern..." Blake reached the shelter and pulled aside the jacket. Behind it, the shelter's interior was visible, and inside, curled in a fetal position, was Jordan Hayes. "We've got him," Blake shouted. "Hansen, Morrison, we found Hayes." But something in Blake's voice changed mid-sentence, excitement transforming into confusion. Morrison reached the shelter, looked inside, went very still. Hansen crossed the creek, the glacial water shocking even through his boots. He reached the shelter and looked inside. Jordan Hayes was there, yes. But Hayes was wrong in ways that Hansen's mind struggled to process. The body was curled too tight, joints bent at angles that human anatomy didn't allow. The skin was gray, desiccated, pulled tight over bones that seemed too long. And the smell, meat left too long in summer heat, but underneath that something chemical, poisonous. Morrison knelt, reached to check for a pulse, then jerked his hand back. "He's cold. Like really cold. Frozen." "That's impossible," Blake said. "It's June. Even overnight temperatures don't get below freezing." Hansen forced himself to look closer, to observe with the detached scientific method he'd trained for years to maintain. Hayes' eyes were open, staring, completely black. No whites, no iris, just darkness. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that seemed longer than they should be, sharper. and the stomach. Hayes's stomach was distended, swollen, as if he'd consumed an enormous amount of something. "We need to get him out of here," Morrison said. "Get medical attention." Hayes moved. Not a lot. Just a twitch of the fingers, a slight turn of the head. But it was movement. Impossible movement, because no one could survive in the condition this body was in. The eyes rolled toward them. The mouth worked, jaw clicking with each movement, and a voice emerged raw and damaged. "Hungry." The three Rangers scrambled backward. Hayes sat up, movement jerky and wrong, like a puppet pulled by inexpert strings. The distended stomach rippled with movement from inside. "So hungry," Hayes said again, the voice layered now, multiple tones speaking simultaneously. "Never satisfied, never enough." Hansen understood then, with terrible clarity. Hayes hadn't built the shelter. Hayes hadn't survived out here through some miraculous endurance. Hayes was gone, consumed, and what was sitting up in the shelter wearing Hayes's body was something else entirely. The Wendigo didn't just kill, it transformed. It created more of itself through violation of the ultimate taboo. "Run," Hansen whispered. Then louder, "Run!" They ran, crashing back across the creek, water splashing, stones sliding under their boots. Behind them, the thing that had been Jordan Hayes emerged from the shelter with movements that defied biology, limbs extending beyond human range, spine bending in ways that should have been lethal. And it was laughing, a sound like ice cracking, like starvation screaming. Morrison hit his radio while running. "All units, this is Morrison. We have a situation at Avalanche Creek Drainage. Unknown threat, ranger safety compromised, requesting immediate..." Static consumed the transmission. All three radios simultaneously dissolved into white noise. They scrambled up the ravine, grabbing roots and rocks, their lungs burning. The temperature was plummeting now, dropping degree by degree, frost forming on vegetation, ice crystals appearing in the air itself. Blake slipped, slid back 5 feet, caught himself on a root. The haze thing was climbing after them, moving fast, impossibly fast, closing the distance with each second. Hansen grabbed Blake's arm, hauled him up. They reached the boardwalk, turned toward the ranger station, kept running. Behind them, the haze thing reached the trail and stopped, as if hitting an invisible barrier. It stood at the edge of the boardwalk, swaying, the black eyes tracking them. Then it spoke again. And this time the voice was different. Multiple voices, dozens of voices, all speaking in unison. The pattern continues. The hunger grows. The transformation spreads. Hansen looked back, his horror crystallizing into terrible understanding. The 14 disappearances, all during early summer, all during new moon. This wasn't random predation. This was a cycle, a pattern of transformation and hunger that perpetuated itself across decades. "How many are there?" he whispered. The haze thing smiled, revealing teeth that were definitely not human anymore. "We are legion. We are hunger. We are the price of violation." Then it turned and walked back into the forest, movement becoming less human with each step, body elongating, transforming, until it was indistinguishable from the skeletal shape Hansen had glimpsed at the tree line hours earlier. The three rangers reached the station as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that looked too much like fire, like warning. They locked themselves inside, pulled the blinds, turned on every light. Hansen's hands shook as he tried to write a report, tried to document what they'd witnessed. But how did you write "encountered cannibalistic transformation entity from Algonquian mythology" in official Park Service paperwork? Morrison was on the phone with Rodriguez, trying to explain the situation in language that wouldn't get them immediately placed on psychiatric leave. Blake sat in a corner staring at nothing, occasionally whispering, "That wasn't Hayes anymore," like a mantra. Hansen's laptop screen showed his deleted blog post, the cursor blinking where text used to be. He thought about his 40,000 followers, about his book deal, about his PhD and his reputation, all built on the foundation of rational skepticism, of scientific materialism, of the certainty that myths were just misunderstood natural phenomena. He opened a browser and searched for Wendigo scholarly sources. The results were extensive: anthropological papers, indigenous knowledge documentation, historical accounts. He started reading, his worldview fragmenting with each paragraph. The Wendigo wasn't just a myth. It was documented across Algonquian cultures: Ojibwe, Cree, Innu, Naskapi. A spiritual entity representing the ultimate transgression, cannibalism. Those who consumed human flesh, whether through necessity or choice, risked transformation into Wendigo. They became embodiments of insatiable hunger, forever craving but never satisfied, growing larger and more skeletal with each victim consumed. And the condition was contagious. Those killed by Wendigo could become Wendigo themselves, perpetuating the cycle. The Blackfeet weren't Algonquian. They were Blackfoot Confederacy, different cultural tradition. But territories overlapped, stories traveled, and some horrors were universal enough that they transcended cultural boundaries. Hansen found a paper from 1981 by an anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Whitmore, who'd studied Wendigo accounts in northern communities. She'd documented over 200 cases across 3 centuries where the Wendigo belief led to real deaths. Sometimes people killed and consumed by others who'd undergone psychological breakdown in isolation. Sometimes people executed by their communities for showing Wendigo symptoms. But Whitmore had also documented cases that defied rational explanation. Temperature anomalies, disappearances with no bodies recovered, tracks that didn't match known animals. Witnesses describing encounters with entities that violated physical laws. Her conclusion was carefully worded, academically cautious. While many Wendigo accounts can be attributed to psychological and environmental factors, a subset of cases present anomalies that warrant further investigation, using methodologies that account for the possibility of phenomena beyond current scientific paradigms. In layman's terms, maybe it's real, but I can't say that outright or I'll lose my tenure. Hansen's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. He opened it, his stomach clenching. The message showed a photograph, a selfie taken in the forest. Jordan Hayes, smiling, giving a thumbs up, clearly alive and well. The timestamp showed 4:47 p.m. today, less than 2 hours ago. Below the image, a single word: hungry. Hansen dropped the phone, backed away from it like it might bite. Morrison looked over, saw his expression. "What is it?" Hansen showed him the phone. Morrison went pale. "That's impossible. Hayes was what we saw down there." "Wasn't Hayes anymore," Blake said from his corner. "I told you. That wasn't Hayes." The lights in the ranger station flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. Outside, full darkness had fallen. New moon. No ambient light except the stars, and even those seemed dimmer than they should be. Hansen heard scratching on the station's roof. Slow, deliberate, like something with long claws testing the structure's integrity. Morrison drew his service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock 22 that seemed absurdly inadequate against what they'd seen. "What do we do?" "We survive until dawn," Hansen said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "We document everything, and we make sure no one else comes into this drainage." "The full SAR team is mobilizing," Morrison said. "They'll be here within the hour. We can't just let them walk into—" "We radio them," Hansen said. "We tell them to stage at the trailhead but not proceed. We explain something. Anything that keeps them from going down into that ravine in the dark." Blake laughed, high and brittle. "Explain what? That Jordan Hayes is both dead and texting us selfies? That there are cannibalistic transformation spirits in Glacier National Park? That the Rational Ranger blog was completely fucking wrong about everything?" Hansen flinched at the accuracy of that last statement. His entire career, his identity, had been built on debunking exactly this, on providing rational explanations for irrational fears, on being the voice of reason in a wilderness full of superstition. And he'd been wrong. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The scratching on the roof intensified, joined by another sound, tapping on windows all around the station. as if multiple entities were testing the barriers simultaneously. Hansen moved to his laptop, opened a new document. If they didn't survive the night, someone needed to find a record. Someone needed to know the truth. He titled it, The Wendigo Protocol, Emergency Procedures for Avalanche Creek Drainage. Then he began writing, documenting everything, the tree's growth, the temperature anomalies, the tracks, the symbols, the haze transformation. He included coordinates, dates, lunar phases. He added excerpts from the historical disappearance records, Dr. Whitmore's research, the Blackfeet warnings, and he wrote recommendations: permanent closure of the drainage, consultation with indigenous knowledge keepers, prohibition on entry during new moon phases, ongoing monitoring for Wendigo symptoms in anyone who'd been exposed. Morrison managed to get a radio message out to the incoming SAR team. Hold position at trailhead. Do not, repeat, do not proceed into Avalanche Creek drainage until daylight. Hazardous conditions, nature TBD. This is not a drill. The response was confused questions, requests for clarification. Morrison did his best to explain without sounding insane, settling finally on possible contamination event, environmental hazard, recommend full protective protocols. It was 11:47 p.m. when the window shattered. Not broken by thrown object or wind, the glass simply exploded inward, as if something had pressed against it until molecular bonds failed. Frost poured through the opening like liquid, pooling on the floor, spreading across surfaces. The temperature inside the station dropped 30 degrees in seconds. And through the broken window, elongated fingers reached, tipped with claws that looked like icicles, like bone, like things that shouldn't exist. The fingers grasped the window frame, and the thing outside began pulling itself through. Morrison fired his Glock. 3 shots, center mass, exactly as trained. The bullets passed through the entity as if through smoke impacting the far wall. The thing that had been Jordan Hayes smiled at them with too many teeth. Hansen grabbed the emergency flare from his pack, ignited it, held it up. The haze thing recoiled from the light, hissing the sound like water on hot metal. It withdrew through the window, disappearing into the darkness. Fire, Hansen said. They avoid fire. The old accounts mentioned that. Wendigo fear flames. They pulled every heat source they could find. Emergency flares, camp stoves, even crumpled paper lit in the trash can. The station filled with smoke and light, uncomfortable but better than the alternative. The entities circled outside, visible occasionally in silhouette against the starlight. Multiple shapes now, not just haze. 14 disappearances across 8 decades, Hansen thought. 14 transformations. How many had survived to perpetuate the cycle? His laptop chimed, email notification. Hansen checked it reflexively, his mind running on autopilot. The email was from his publisher. Greg, love the Wendigo debunking piece outline. Can't wait to read the full manuscript. This is going to be huge for the Rational Ranger brand. Hansen laughed, the sound emerging broken and wrong. The Rational Ranger brand, built on certainty, on skepticism, on the absolute conviction that he knew better than the superstitious masses who believed in ghosts and spirits and things that went bump in the night. He hit reply, typed, "Cancel the book. The Wendigo is real. I was wrong about everything, I'm sorry." But before he could send it, the power died. Total darkness except for the flickering flares which were burning down, minutes from exhaustion. "We're not going to make it to dawn," Blake said quietly. "Are we?" Hansen checked his watch. 1:23 a.m. Sunrise wouldn't come until 5:47, over 4 hours in darkness, with diminishing light sources, surrounded by entities that had once been human. "Yes," he said, trying to sound convinced. "We are, because we have to. Because if we don't, no one will believe what happened here. No one will take the precautions necessary to prevent more disappearances." Morrison was at the radio, trying different frequencies, looking for any connection to the outside world. "I can't get anything. It's like there's interference across the entire spectrum." The scratching resumed, now on all sides of the station simultaneously. testing, probing, looking for weaknesses. The entities were patient, Hansen realized. They'd been doing this for decades, maybe longer. They understood waiting. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Hayes's number. This time, a video. Hansen knew he shouldn't watch it. Knew it would show something designed to break him, to create the psychological vulnerability the Wendigo could exploit. But morbid curiosity, the same drive that had made him a researcher, made him tap the play button. The video showed the forest in darkness, shot from a moving perspective. Shaky footage, like someone running. Heavy breathing on the audio. Then a voice, Hayes's voice. "If anyone finds this, I'm so hungry. I can't think about anything else. The cold is inside me now, freezing everything except the hunger. I found there were others in the forest, others who were hungry, and they told me how to make it stop, told me what I had to do." The camera swung to show a figure ahead in the darkness, another hiker unaware of Hayes approaching. "I'm sorry," Hayes's voice said. "I'm so sorry, but I can't help it. The hunger is everything." The video cut to black before showing what happened next, but Hansen heard the screams, brief and terrible, before silence returned. The timestamp on the video, 3 days ago. Hayes was infected before he even disappeared, Hansen whispered. He came here already transforming. The Wendigo spreads like a disease. Then everyone who's been in that drainage is at risk, Morrison said. Everyone who's been exposed to the cold, the entities. All three of us, Blake finished. They looked at each other in the dying flare light, each searching the other's faces for signs of transformation. Dilated pupils, lengthening teeth, that insatiable hunger. Hansen felt his stomach twist. But was it fear or the beginning of something else? Had the cold in the ravine done more than just threaten? Had it infected them, started the transformation that would eventually turn them into what Hayes had become? The last flare guttered out. In the absolute darkness, Hansen heard movement inside the station. Not outside anymore. Inside. Something had gotten in while they'd been distracted by the video, by fear, by their own vulnerability. "Lights," Morrison hissed. "Anyone have lights?" Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the station interior. For a moment, nothing. Then Blake's beam caught something near the shattered window. A figure, crouched in the corner. Too tall, too thin, joints bending wrong. Black eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. But it wasn't Hayes. It was wearing a park ranger uniform from decades past, the name tag reading S. Cooper. Samuel Cooper, the ranger who'd written the 1967 report, who'd warned about the Wendigo. "You didn't listen," Cooper's voice said, layered with that terrible multi-tone echo. "I tried to warn them, tried to protect others, but they thought I was crazy. And when the hunger came for me, there was no one to hear me scream." Hansen's mind raced through the implications. Cooper hadn't just resigned and died naturally. Cooper had been taken, transformed, condemned to spend decades as a Wendigo, watching more victims come to the drainage he'd tried to close. "We're listening now," Hansen said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We believe you. We'll close the area. We'll stop more people from coming here, but you have to let us survive to do it." The Cooper thing tilted its head, considering. Promises. The living always promise, but they forget. They rationalize, they convince themselves it wasn't real, just like you did before today. "I won't forget," Hansen said. "I can't. You've destroyed my career, my reputation, my entire worldview. The only thing I have left is making sure this stops." "Your career?" The Cooper thing laughed. "I was a ranger for 23 years. I had a wife, children, a normal life. And then I spent 46 years as this, as hunger and cold and endless craving. Your career is already over, Hansen. The question is whether you end it as human or as hunger." The entity moved closer, and Hansen saw its ranger uniform was frost-covered, ancient, preserved by the same impossible cold that animated the creature. Behind it, more shapes were becoming visible in the darkness. Other transformed rangers, Other victims, all the disappearances across 8 decades coalescing into a gallery of the damned. Morrison fired his Glock again, the muzzle flash illuminating the station in stark white bursts. The bullets passed through the entities without effect. Waste of ammunition, Hansen thought distantly. Can't kill what's already dead. Last flare, Blake said, holding it up. Once this goes, we're in total darkness. Hansen's hands moved on instinct, pulling out his lighter, his field notebook. He ripped out pages, began building a small fire in the middle of the station floor. Against fire codes, against every regulation, but regulations didn't cover defense against cannibalistic transformation spirits. The paper caught, flames spreading, small, inadequate, but the entities pulled back slightly, maintaining distance from the light and heat. Keep it going, Hansen said. Morrison, Blake, anything that burns, we feed the fire until dawn. They worked frantically, feeding the flames with paper, cardboard, even pieces of furniture. The fire grew, pushing back the darkness, creating a circle of safety. The entities circled at the edge of the light, waiting, patient, hunger without end. Hansen found himself thinking about his blog, his book, his certainty that he understood how the world worked. 40,000 followers who trusted him to debunk nonsense, to provide rational explanations. What would they think if they could see him now, burning furniture to ward off Wendigo in a Glacier National Park ranger station? Would they think he'd lost his mind? Would they rationalize it away, find psychological explanations for his breakdown? Or would some of them, the ones who'd always felt that edge of unease in deep wilderness, understand that he'd discovered a truth more fundamental than his education had prepared him for? The Cooper thing spoke again, from the shadows. You feel it. Already, don't you? The cold inside, the hunger starting. We don't need to attack you, Hansen. The transformation has already begun. By dawn, you'll be one of us. Hansen pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the cold spot where he'd entered the drainage, where the temperature had dropped impossibly. The cold had gotten inside him, into his core. And yes, beneath the fear and adrenaline, he felt something else. An emptiness. A craving that had nothing to do with ordinary hunger. Fight it, Morrison said, seeing his expression. Whatever you're feeling, fight it. But Morrison's eyes were too wide, pupils dilated beyond what fear alone would cause. And Blake had stopped feeding the fire, was staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. They were all infected, all transforming. The question was just how long they could hold out. Hansen's phone, nearly dead, buzzed one last time. A final text from Hayes's number. Welcome to forever, Dr. Hansen. The hunger never ends, but you'll learn to love it. The battery died. The phone went dark. And in that moment, Hansen felt something shift inside him. The last resistance crumbling, the rational mind that had defined him for 34 years, fragmenting against the inexorable truth of transformation. He was going to become a Wendigo. They all were. And there was nothing his PhD or his skepticism or his 40,000 followers could do to prevent it. Unless Hansen looked at the fire, at the flames that kept the entities at bay. He thought about the protective symbols carved into trees, about indigenous knowledge he'd dismissed as superstition, about warnings he'd ignored in favor of rationalist certainty. The symbols, he said, the carvings in the drainage, they weren't just decorative, they were functional, protective magic. Magic isn't real, Blake said automatically, then laughed at the absurdity of the statement given their current situation. Magic is just technology we don't understand yet, Hansen countered, and right now I don't care about understanding, I care about surviving. He pulled up the photos on his camera, the ones he'd taken of the tree symbols before his equipment had died. The patterns were complex but repetitive, based on geometry and cultural symbolism he didn't fully grasp but could reproduce. Using his knife, he began carving the symbols into the station's wooden walls. Morrison and Blake, understanding, joined him. They worked frantically, reproducing the protective patterns, creating a barrier of intent and tradition around their sanctuary. The entities reacted immediately, pressing closer, testing the symbols, searching for gaps. But where the carvings were complete, They couldn't pass. Ancient knowledge preserved across generations proved stronger than their hunger. "It's working," Morrison said, wonder in his voice. "It's actually working." They carved until their hands bled, until symbols covered every wall, every surface. And slowly, the pressure from outside decreased. The entities pulled back, not defeated but temporarily held at bay. Hansen checked his watch. 4:53 a.m. Less than an hour to sunrise. They huddled near the fire as dawn approached. 3 rangers who'd entered the day as skeptics and would leave it, if they left it, fundamentally changed. The cold inside Hansen was still there, still growing, but the symbols seemed to slow it, contain it. At 5:47 a.m., the sun broke over the eastern peaks, and the entities fled. Not slowly, not reluctantly, but in sudden panicked retreat, as if sunlight itself was poison to them. The forest became normal again. Just wilderness, just trees, just the ordinary dangers of bears and cliffs and exposure. The radio crackled to life. "Ranger Station, this is SAR team. We're at the trailhead. What's your status?" Morrison picked up the radio with shaking hands. "We're alive, but we need immediate medical evacuation, and we need the Avalanche Creek drainage closed, permanently." "Copy that. Medical helicopter inbound. What's the nature of the emergency?" Morrison looked at Hansen, at Blake, at the symbol-covered walls and the dying fire and the shattered window. "Nature of emergency is complicated. Recommend full decontamination protocols and consultation with Blackfeet Nation representatives. This is cultural territory, and we've encountered something that requires traditional knowledge to address. Professional language for, we met the Wendigo and barely survived." The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, landing in the trailhead parking lot. EMTs examined them, found hypothermia, minor injuries, and psychological trauma, but nothing physically life-threatening. They were transported to Kalispell Regional Medical Center, placed under observation. Their statements recorded by park supervisors who clearly thought they'd experienced some kind of shared psychotic break. Hansen didn't try to convince them otherwise. He just asked for one thing: that the Avalanche Creek drainage be closed pending investigation, and that consultation with indigenous knowledge keepers be prioritized. To his surprise, they agreed. Maybe because 3 rangers all telling the same impossible story carried weight. Maybe because the historical record supported their claims. Maybe because no one wanted to risk more disappearances during an investigation. Or maybe, Hansen thought, some part of them believed. Some part remembered the old stories, the warnings, the knowledge that wilderness held more than just bears and weather. He spent 3 days in the hospital, his body recovering from hypothermia and exposure. But the cold inside him didn't leave. It stayed. A constant reminder of how close he'd come to transformation, how thin the line between human and hunger. On the 4th day, a visitor arrived, an elder from the Blackfeet Nation, a woman named Mary Runningcrane, who introduced herself as a knowledge keeper and spiritual practitioner. She'd been briefed on what happened, and she came to Hansen's hospital room with a gravity that suggested she took it seriously. "You've been touched by the Witiko," she said without preamble. "The cold is in you now. It won't leave on its own." "Is there a cure?" Hansen asked. "Some way to remove it?" "There are ceremonies," Mary said. "Traditional practices for cleansing and protection. But they require commitment, belief, and respect for knowledge you've spent your life dismissing." Hansen thought about his blog, his book deal, his reputation as the rational ranger. All built on dismissing exactly this kind of traditional knowledge. "I'm ready to learn," he said simply. Mary nodded. "Good, because the Witiko doesn't just claim individuals. It spreads, infects, perpetuates. You've been exposed, which means you carry it now. Without proper cleansing, you could become a vector for transformation. And that drainage, it needs more than closure. It needs spiritual attention, proper protocols, ceremonies that haven't been performed in decades." Over the following weeks, Hansen worked with Mary and other Blackfeet knowledge keepers. He underwent cleansing ceremonies, learned traditional protections, studied the cultural context he'd previously ignored. And he wrote a new kind of article, Not a debunking piece, but an honest accounting of his experience and his mistakes. He titled it, "The Rational Ranger Was Wrong, A Confession and Apology." He published it to his blog, expecting backlash, mockery, the end of his credibility. Instead, he got 40,000 responses from people sharing their own inexplicable experiences, their encounters with things that shouldn't exist, their relief that someone with scientific credentials was finally saying, "I don't know, and that's okay." The Avalanche Creek drainage was permanently closed. Protective symbols, properly blessed and maintained by Blackfeet spiritual practitioners, were installed throughout the area. Warning signs went up, not mentioning Wendigo that would invite tourism, but citing culturally sensitive indigenous sacred ground and unstable environmental conditions. Disappearances in the drainage ceased. The new moon came and went without incident. The pattern finally was broken, but Hansen knew it wasn't truly over. The entities were still there, contained but not destroyed, waiting with patient hunger for the protections to fail, for people to forget, for the cycle to resume. He requested permanent transfer to Glacier, specifically to monitor the drainage and maintain the protective protocols. He became liaison with the Blackfeet Nation, learning from elders, documenting traditional knowledge with proper respect and permission. His blog transformed from Rational Ranger to something new, a platform for discussing the intersection of scientific method and traditional knowledge, for exploring mysteries with humility rather than skepticism, for acknowledging that some questions didn't have tidy answers. He never saw Jordan Hayes again, never recovered the body. Sometimes on new moon nights, he thought he heard whispers from the drainage, that layered voice, that eternal hunger, but the protections held. And he grew to trust in knowledge older than his PhD. Morrison and Blake recovered, underwent similar cleansing ceremonies, and transferred to other parks. They stayed in touch with Hansen, 3 people bound by shared trauma and transformation, by the knowledge that the world was stranger and more terrible than any of them had believed. And late at night, when Hansen was alone in his quarters, he still felt the cold spot in his chest, the hunger that never quite left, a reminder that he'd come within hours of transformation, that the Wendigo was patient, that the boundary between human and horror was thinner than any rational mind wanted to admit. He kept carving the protective symbols, kept performing the ceremonies Mary taught him, kept watching the drainage with vigilance that bordered on paranoia, because he knew what waited in those woods, in that impossible cold, in the hunger that never ended. 14 disappearances across 8 decades, 14 transformations. The pattern was broken, but not erased. The victims were contained, but not freed. And Gregory Hansen, formerly the Rational Ranger, formerly certain that myths were just misunderstood science, now understood a deeper truth. Some horrors were real, some hungers were eternal, and some knowledge could only be gained by coming within a breath of losing your humanity entirely. The Wendigo was real, and it was waiting. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.